Now, McLuhan's critics have been fond of making the counterstatement that the medium is not the message, and really to the point that that kind of denial has become something of a cliche. And of course it misses McLuhan's point entirely. We all know that the medium and the message are separate categories. That's the starting point. And so dismissing McLuhan simply leaves us back at square one. The critics seem to think that we're dealing with a kind of mathematical equation, and McLuhan's saying, let X equal medium, let Y equal message, such that X equals Y. But McLuhan's not a mathematician. The medium as the message is a metaphor, not a math problem. It's poetic, and it's a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron. Its purpose is to call our attention to the complex dialectical relationship between medium and message. And McLuhan's critics have also taken him to task for denying the existence of content altogether, which would certainly be an absurdity, but in point of fact, he's merely trying to put content in its place, a secondary role in relation to the medium. Whatever the consequences of the messages we send, and of course there are consequences, it's the media we use that play the leading role in human affairs. It's our technologies that shape us individually and collectively. McLuhan's emphasis on media effects have led some of his critics to label his approach as technological determinism. That's really a straw man argument that's used to caricature McLuhan as some sort of media Calvinist and to dismiss his arguments without serious consideration. After all, most people get upset at the denial of free will in theory as well as in practice, but McLuhan never used the term determinism, nor did he argue against human agency. In his best-selling book, The Medium is the Massage, he wrote, "There's absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to contemplate what is happening." I think John Culkin summed it up nicely when an associate of McLuhan's when he said, "We shape our tools and thereafter they shape us." It's a transactional approach to media. Free will does not mean freedom from limits, constraints, and outside influences. And as diffusion researcher Everett Rogers puts it, innovations have consequences. And while some of the consequences may be desirable, others may not be. And while some consequences may be direct effects of the introduction of a new technology, those direct effects will lead to other effects that are indirect and to further indirect effects in a kind of butterfly effect. And while some consequences may be anticipated, there will always be unanticipated, unpredictable consequences to the introduction of new technologies. And along the same lines, it may be true that a good part of what we call reality is a social construction. But the construction we end up with is not necessarily the one that we intended to build. And after all, construction begins with raw materials and the tools to shape them. Media are the stuff with which we build our social realities. Now, other critics complain about media ecology scholars, including Havelock and Hahn, that they are putting forth a great divide theory, exaggerating the differences between orality and literacy, for example. And it's true that we see a divide between orality and literacy. We also see a divide between word and image, and a divide between the alphabet on the one hand and pictographic, hieroglyphic, ideographic writing on the other. A divide between clay tablets and papyrus in the ancient world, and between parchment and paper in the modern. Between scribal copying and the printing press, another divide. A divide between typography and electronic media. A divide between the virtual and non-virtual worlds. And I could continue on with this list, but the point is that there are a great many divides. We're interested in differences. The differences, as Wendell Johnson put it, those differences that make a difference. And so there's no one single great divide, but many different divides that concern us. And critics miss the point that media ecology scholars often work dialectically, using contrasts to understand media. And this is a dialectic approach that's not an end in and of itself for media ecology scholars, but rather a step that brings us a little closer to a truly ecological perspective, where we look at the interactions and oppositions of many different factors. Media ecology scholars also use broad categories like oral, scribal, print, and electronic cultures. And these are alternatives to divisions such as agricultural, industrial, and information societies. It's based on the idea that it's communication, not economics, that most influences social life. In this sense, we would view the evolution of speech and the development of language as intrinsically related to our origins as human beings, that the human species is more or less defined by speech and language. And then the development of writing from various forms of notation is associated with a transition from tribal societies to what traditionally was called civilization. It is people settling down in increasingly more complex forms of social organization, ultimately leading to the cities of the ancient world, which then extended their control over empires. The substitution of paper for parchment and the printing revolution that began with Gutenberg is tied to the shift from the medieval period to the modern period. Again, printing is what made us modern. And the electronic and audiovisual media that have been introduced over the course of the 19th, 20th, and into the 21st century. With that, we recognize that we've entered a new period of history, one that we've yet to understand. We don't even know what to call it. That's why some people call it postmodern, which means we don't know what it is, we just know it's not what it used to be. But we could call it electronic. And each of these broadly defined historical periods can also be understood as a basic type of media environment, that is the oral, scribal, print, and electronic media environments. But media ecology scholars also recognize that any given society at any given time has its own unique media environment. So whether we focus on the general or the specific, what is important to understand is that media are environments. And it's more common to think of media in terms of a pipeline or transportation. I think of it as football. You carry the foot. The medium is the running back who carries the football, or the pass that sends the football from point A to point B. It's bridges to points, but media ecology scholars have long been critical of this transportation model. McLuhan arguing that instead of transportation, we should be thinking about transformation. Tony Schwartz said that instead we should use the concept of resonance, an acoustic concept. James Carey suggested that we substitute ritual for transportation. And Walter Ong said simply that we use human communication in place of transportation. All of these possibilities have ecological connections, but the question in term, medium, is also defined. If you look at a dictionary, what does medium mean? One of its meanings is a substance that surrounds or pervades, that goes between 2 points, not by drawing a straight line between them, but by drawing a circle around them. For example, fish swim through the medium of water, just as we move through the medium of air, and bacteria such as acidophilus live in the medium of milk, which they transform into yogurt. And we call that colony of bacteria a culture. In other words, as Neil Postman has explained, cultures are formed within media rather than media simply being produced by cultures.